All right, so we're starting a new series discussing two Torahs in Likutei Moharan Tinyana, Torah Chaf Gimel and Chaf Dalet, which give us some insight into Rebbe Nachman's perspectives on Simchah, and we're going to be learning these two Torahs in depth for the next 2 months, along with many other people and numerous other excellent Magidei Shir who will be bringing their own perspectives to this. And we're just going to start tonight, very basically, just trying to get an overall picture of Torah Chaf Gimel. We're going to just read through Torah Chaf Gimel and try to learn it on a very simple, very basic level. And hopefully in coming weeks, we'll dive into it more from the perspective of Bina rather than the perspective of Chachma, working our way downwards. From the top to a more concrete and practical understanding of what he's trying to say. We'll begin with an overall picture in the sense of Chachma, and in the coming weeks, we'll break it down into more specific parts, and we'll dive in and we'll try to understand more deeply what he's saying. So he begins in Torah Chaf Gimel. He says, Be'inyan ha-simcha. He says, regarding Simcha. Now, even before we begin, I think it's just worth, at least raising questions as we go along. It's worth asking ourselves what he means, what Rebbe Nachman means when he speaks about Simcha here, right? The Inyan ha-Simcha, we're going to discuss Simcha. Regarding Simcha, he says that he's going to discuss ideas regarding Simcha, but what is Simcha? It's going to become clear throughout the piece that the idea of Simcha he has is something much deeper than just happiness. It's much deeper than just laughter, happiness, silliness, dancing and clapping and singing. It's something deeper than, dare I say, happy, clappy Hasidus and happy, clappy Judaism. Simcha here is something much deeper. As will become clear, this is clearly his perspective. True Simcha is something much deeper than just surface level happiness. It's a deep-seated contentment and joy. In other places, Rebbe Nachman talks about how Simcha is an entry point and is a cause and a cause for sipuk hanefesh and menuchas hanefesh, a kind of settledness and contentment. And so joy here doesn't necessarily, Simcha, joy doesn't necessarily mean happy. It can mean happy, but happiness could exist absent joy. And joy can exist even absent many kinds of external happiness. We find in the Rambam, in Hilchos Deos, the Rambam tells us in the famous passage in Hilchos Deos, Parak Aleph, Halacha Dalet, where he tells us that the proper way in all things is kind of a medium path, is an average, is a mean, is a balanced path in all kinds of midos. He says that when it comes to Simcha, he says a person shouldn't be too frivolous and too happy. Lo yehe mehuel v'silchek. And a person shouldn't be frivolous and silly, and a person also shouldn't be despondent and dejected. Ela sameach kol yamav b'nachas. Rather, a person should be joyful. Simcha. A person should have simcha kol yamav b'nachas in a settled way, in a calm way. B'sever panim yafos, with a pleasant face, with a pleasant countenance. Right, so the Simcha we're going to be talking about here is not surface level. It's something much deeper. Now it's true, and I just want to add a caveat to this before we dive in, and that it is true that elsewhere Rebbe Nachman does say that there's a very great and important value that sometimes when a person is not feeling joyful, not feeling happy, sometimes you do whatever you need to do in order to feel happy, and sometimes that means doing silly things. Listening to a joke, acting silly, dancing, clapping, singing, doing all of those surface level, silly, happy things to try and induce a sense of joy, to knock yourself out of a state of despondency and stuckness in whatever kind of atzvos and difficulty a person is experiencing. But that's not the end state of simcha. Okay, so b'inyan simcha, regarding simcha, al pi mashal, al derech mashal, in a metaphorical sense, we can say, shelipa'amin k'shebnei adam semechim umerakim, sometimes when people are happy, joyful, and dancing, azai, chotvim ish echad mibachutz, they grab somebody else from outside of the dancing circle, shehu ba'atzvos umarshor, and that person is standing outside of the dancing circle, sitting on the side in a state of atzvos, in a state of sadness and depression, umarashchora, and sort of gloominess, darkness. And they drag him in against his will into the circle of the dancing people that are happy, that are joyful. And they force him to join them and to also be sameach with them, to be joyful with them. That's the mashal. That's the mashal for the idea of simcha that he wants to talk about here. Okay? I'm probably I've certainly experienced this. Anyone who knows me can imagine that I've easily experienced this. I'm sitting outside the circle. I'm usually not much of a dancer, and sitting outside the circle, and some obnoxious person who's in the circle drags you and pulls you off from the chair, Simchas Torah or at a wedding or whatever it happens to be, drags you off the chair that you're sitting on and pulls you into the circle. And here Rabbi Nachman is saying that this is a powerful metaphor for simcha itself, or a certain aspect of simcha. Kain yesh be'inyan simcha. The same thing happens when it comes to simcha. Ki adam sameach, when a person is happy, when a person is joyful, azai, then hamara shechora, their gloominess, v'hayisurim, and their pains and their difficulties, nistalkim min hatzad, they get pushed to the side, they move away to the side, right? Joy and sorrow don't like to mix with each other, Rebbe Nachman says. And so a person oftentimes, when they're experiencing joy, what happens is that they are joyful, and the bad mood that they happen to be in, or their troubles, or their difficulties, or their anxieties, or their gloominess, it flees from the joyfulness. It hides in a corner. Because while the person is being joyful, the gloominess, the bad mood, the negative feelings don't want to be around. They run away. And there's something to that, right? There's something to that, because then I'm able to experience joy. I was experiencing Mara Shechora and Atzvos. I was experiencing negativity. I was experiencing gloominess. I was experiencing despondency. And then for whatever reason, due to whatever trigger, I start to experience a sense of joy. And I'm filled with that sense of joy. And rather than having this internal conflict where my joy is dampened by this anxiety or that worry or this resentment or that concern, this point of sadness or despondency, instead of all of that, I can actually experience my joy. I'm fully joyful because my negativity, my negative feelings, my sadness, my despondency, my anger, my resentment, it moves away. It hides in a box somewhere off to the side. However, and there's something to that, however, a higher level of simcha is to strengthen oneself, to run after the marashor, to run after the gloominess, specifically to run after the gloominess, and to drag the gloominess, to drag the despondency, the anxiety, the resentment, the anger, and so on and so forth, to drag that into the simcha that a person is experiencing. Just like the joyful people dancing in the circle may drag a person who is not feeling joyful, who's standing off to the side and not participating. The gloominess is present, but it's off to the side. It's not ruining the circle. And then the people reach out from the circle and they grab someone who's standing on the side and they pull him into the circle. Likewise, that's a metaphor for the internal experience of simcha, where a person internally experiences a sense of joy, a sense of simcha. And when they experience that simcha, the negativity within them, the atzvos, the marshachora, the yisurim, they go away, they move away to the side. They don't want to participate for obvious reasons. And the avoda within simcha is then for a person who's experiencing simcha to take that simcha and to use it to reach out, dafka, to grab on to the opposite of simcha within themselves and drag that opposite of simcha, drag that gloominess, drag that despondency, drag that upsetness into the simcha that they're experiencing. Ba'ofen shamar shechora ba'atzma tishapek l'simcha. In a way that despondency and that gloominess will in and of itself be transformed, the nahafahu will be transformed into simcha. And thereby a person, he will be able to transform the negativity that he's experiencing, the pain that he's experiencing, with simcha, into joy. This is like a person who comes into a simcha. And because of the joy and the happiness that they experience when they enter into that state of simcha, all of the worries and all of the sadnesses and all of the gloominess that within them is transformed. Mehafech is transformed into simcha. It's not pushed away. It's not put in a box to the side and I'll access it later. It's there, it's present, I'm experiencing it, I'm acknowledging it, it's real, and it's going to be transformed into simcha. It becomes fuel for simcha. It in of itself creates new, higher levels of simcha, complete simcha, an integrated simcha, not a simcha that has to ignore and leave the marash kora and leave the atzvos and leave the yisurim off to the side. That's right now I'm experiencing simcha and I'm compartmentalizing and saying, now I'm happy. And the sadness is going to go over there right now, and the sadness is not going to interfere with my happiness, and I can be really happy now, and the sadness will be there later. I'll pick it up later when I come back to it. No, Rabbi Nachman is saying that dafka person needs to seek integration, to drag this atzvos, to drag the yisurim, to drag the marshor that are off to the side, that are put in a box over there, and they put themselves in that box because they don't want to be involved in the simcha, just like the person who removes himself from the circle to go sit on the side. They're not going to dance with everybody else. Specifically, higher levels of simcha or more wholesome senses of simcha require a person to dafka try to integrate the marashachor, the atzvos, the difficulty, the yisurim that they're going through into the simcha that they're experiencing and transform them thereby into simcha itself. Nimtza, what comes out from this is that a person grabs the marshachora and brings it into the simcha against its will, kamashal and now, like the mashal that we mentioned above with the circle of dancing people, where they grab someone from the outside and drag that person into the circle, and that person is transformed in that experience from someone who is full of marshachora and atzvos and negativity into someone who is experiencing joy. Okay, now how this is done and why this is done and how it is accomplished, that's certainly a very, very big question. How is it that you're mishafech sadness and pain and difficulty into simcha, right? It's one thing to compartmentalize it. That's one thing, right? There are stories, many stories of that have been told. I think they're very prevalent, sort of, certainly in yeshiva, of the gadol or the talmid chacham or whatever who was going through terrible things in their life. Maybe they're an avel, or they're in the middle of avelos or whatever it is, and Yom Tov comes along, the avelos ends, they flip on the light switch, and now simcha, because mitzvah, right? V'samach b'dachak, they have to be misameach on Yom Tov, so they're going to be misameach, right? Typically, what that entails is that we're going to take the sadness that we're experiencing, and we're going to compartmentalize it over here, put it in a box, and separate it from the joy that we're experiencing right now. And we experience that joy. And then we'll come back to the other thing afterwards. And there's something about this that's a little bit mechanical, something that's not fully integrated and not fully human. And so Rebbe Nachman is emphasizing that true joy, high levels of joy, not true joy, all joy is truthful as long as it's really there. And even if it's not really there, it can still be truthful because you can truly be pretending to be Mesameach, and that's something as well. It's a whole other long discussion, again, maybe for future weeks, but a much more complete and higher sense of Simcha is be more integrated, a fully integrated person where the Yisurim, the pain, the difficulty is part of the Simcha and becomes Simcha in and of itself. V'zeh bechinas sasam v'simcha yasigu v'nasu yagon v'anacha. And this, Rabbi Nachman says, is a sense of what the pasuk in Yeshaya means when it says sasam v'simcha yasigu, that they will attain those returning to Zion from Golus, they will attain and grasp simcha and sasan, joy and happiness. V'nasu yagon v'anacha, and suffering and pain and sighing will flee in front of it. Shehayagon v'anacha baruchim v'nasim mitnei simcha. Rabbi Nachman says that, what does the pasuk mean? We start off from the end of the pasuk. We're going to learn the pasuk from the end back to the beginning. V'nasu v'yagon v'anacha, that sadness and suffering and sighing and pain and difficulty flee from it. That, like he just said, naturally pain and suffering and difficulty and discontent and resentment and negative feelings, they run away from simcha. They run away from simcha. When there's simcha, the sadness, the difficulty runs away. It doesn't disappear, it runs away, preserves itself. The normal way is that during times of simcha, the simcha overwhelms us, it distracts us, and the yagon va'anacha, the pain, the suffering, the sighing, the heaviness, they stand off to the side. They're there, but they're overwhelmed, they're distracted, we're not paying attention to them so much anymore. The Medrash in Shemos Rabbah uses this pasuk as a description of the successive experiences of Golus. It compares the excessive experiences of Golus to a woman who becomes pregnant, gives birth, which is a very, very difficult and painful and unpleasant process, although it has joy and pleasantness and so on and so forth, but it's challenging and difficult, and there's suffering and pain and difficulty and so on. And she goes through that whole process. She does it again, and then she does it again, and then she does it again, in the sense that the pain and the suffering get pushed off to the side when the joy of the child actually being born and being raised and doing all the key things that they do, they get pushed off to the side. They're not disappeared, but they're off to the side. And then eventually, they come back. And they're still there. But Rabbi Nachman said that what I'm telling you here is that one of the important issues or ideas in Simcha is that a person specifically has to run after this yagon va'anacha, the tsar, the pain, the yisurim, la'asigam ula'giam, in order to catch up with them and grab hold of them, lahachnisosam dafka l'tocha simcha. Canal. To specifically draw them in, bring them into the simcha. I have to take my pain, I have to take my sadness, I have to take my anger, my resentment, and I have to make them part of my simcha. Sasam v'simcha yasigu. Thus, v'zehu, this is what the pasuk says, sasam v'simcha yasigu, they will grab, they will attain sasam and simcha. Sha'asasam v'simcha yasigu, v'yitzvesu, as hayagon v'anacha. The sasan and the simcha will grab and take hold of the yagon v'anacha, of the pain and the suffering, shehem nasim uvarchim and simcha, which are running away from the simcha. As the pain and the suffering are running away, the simcha has to reach out and grab them and draw them back in. Ki yesh l'hachnis osam bal karcham l'tocha simcha kanal. To draw them back in, bring them back in against their will, into the simcha itself. There are some kinds of yadon va'anacha, there are some kinds of sadness and pain and suffering, Rabbi Nachman says, that are from the Sitra Achra. She'enam rotzim lios merkava el kedusha. These kinds of pain and suffering don't want to be, they're fighting against, they don't want to be a merkava towards kedusha, a vehicle for attaining kedusha. Right? Some kinds of pain and suffering. Other kinds of pain and suffering are very much vehicles for kedusha. Other kinds of pain and suffering are ways of attaining kedusha in and of themselves. Rabbi Nachman talks about this in other places where he says that sometimes oftentimes, pain and suffering and difficulty. This is not just Rabbi Nachman, but this is deeply rooted in all of Hasidus, in the Likutei Arizal, and deeper and older than that. Pain and suffering oftentimes are there, and really it's all the way back to the famous Gemara in Brachos about Yisurim Shel Ava. Pain and suffering create a sense of longing and a sense of lack and a sense of need because I'm suffering and I'm in pain. And that need and that lack create a kli, and that kli becomes something that can be filled and that can hold and that can be used to conceptualize and appreciate whole other higher and deeper levels of or, of kedusha, of growth, of experience of dveikus with the Kadosh Baruch Hu, etc. Many, many kinds of yagon va'anacha are really from the sitra de kedusha, are from the side of kedusha, are positive in and of themselves. Minei ubei, they're positive. They're there to create a sense of lack. That sense of lack in and of itself becomes the vehicle and the source for obtaining much higher levels of kedusha. But not all yagon va'anacha, not all pain and suffering functions that way. Sometimes we grow easily through our pain and suffering. Other times, our pain and our suffering doesn't want to let us grow. It runs away from growth. How does it run away from growth? It keeps us stuck in self-pity. It keeps us stuck in a sense of toughness, in a sense of smallness, in a sense of constriction, a poverty mindset. I don't have this, I don't have that, I'm suffering with this, I'm suffering with that. Parnasa, golem bias, kids, all the problems that a person might have, and it keeps them stuck instead of spurring them to reconnect with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. The yagon va'anacha runs away every time there's just a little bit of a twinge of I'm going to use this to connect to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which automatically is a source of simcha and of contentment and luchas hanefesh and sipuch hanefesh and hishtavos and contentment and settledness and so on. Simcha. As soon as that simcha begins to come into play, the yagon va'anacha runs away. It doesn't want to be used for these things. Immediately it reels back its head. It's gathering its reserves, strategic retreat, and it's going to gather its reserves and come back with a vengeance and remind you how bad things really are and how worthless you really are and how much you don't deserve simcha and how the simcha is not real and it's fleeting and it's fake and you're fooling yourself and none of this is real and it's just a fantasy. There are simcha. There's yagon va'anacha that's like that. That's in the sitra achra. That's yagon va'anacha that's coming from the sitra achra, from the yitzhara. Va'al kain hein baruch min simcha, and that kind of yagon va'anacha, that kind of pain and suffering runs from simcha. Doesn't want to be integrated into the simcha. It doesn't want to be turned into a source of simcha in and of itself. It wants to run away. It wants to stay away so that it can't be turned into simcha, so that it's there waiting for you to spring as soon as there's a little bit of an opening. Al kain. And because that kind of simcha exists, al kain, Rabbi Nachman says, therefore, tzarach l'hachriach osam, l'hachnis osam l'toch ha'kedusha. For that specific reason, that's why it's so important to force them and draw those kinds of yagon va'anacha, those kinds of tsar, those kinds of isurim, those kinds of negativity and limitation and sense of worthlessness and resentment and anger and sadness and despondency and all of that. It's critical to then bring them with Tocha Kedusha, to bring them into Kedusha, because if you don't bring them into Kedusha, they're there waiting, they're going to destroy that Kedusha that you're trying so hard to get and that you're gaining little bits of. They're there waiting and they'll grab it and they'll shatter it. they'll remind you how terrible things really are. The Hainu, Simcha, you want to bring it to the Kedusha, which is Simcha. Simcha and Kedusha, note, Simcha and Kedusha are synonymous here. You want to bring these things with Tocha Kedusha, the Hainu HaSimcha, into Kedusha, which is Simcha, Balkach. You have to bring them in against their will. They don't want to be there. They don't want to be natural vehicles and stepping stones, a sense of lack that produces growth. They want to be a sense of lack that retards growth and holds you back. And the only way to deal with those kinds of things, right? The sense of lack, the sense of loss, the sense of suffering and pain that spurs growth, you don't have to force them to be happy. Actually, you want to lean into the despondency. You want to lean into the atzvos, to the sadness, to the yisurim shel ava, because the more you lean into those positive kinds of challenge and difficulty and kushi and tsar and so on, the more you can grow through them, because they produce a sense of need and a sense of lack, a sense of chisaron and kalim to receive more or, and things become much better through that. But other kinds of simcha, the other kinds of yagon va'anacha and tsar, the kinds that keep you trapped and keep you held back, those are the kinds that are very dangerous. You can't lean into them. You can't allow them to exist. As such, you can't allow them to continue to be yagon va'anacha. And the way to change that is not to allow them to exist on the side. Fill yourself with joy, fill yourself with happiness, get in the circle and dance happy clappy and everything is fine. No, because the yagon va'anacha from the Sitra Achra is there waiting for you on the side, and it's going to come right back with vengeance. You have to grab it, you have to lean out of the circle, you have to grab it, and you have to bring it in and transform it into simcha so that it's not there waiting for you. And that takes work. It has to be bal karacham. They're going to fight. The yagon va'anacha are going to fight you. They're going to try to prevent being dragged into the circle. But if you're able to drag them in, you become integrated. You integrate all of your positive and all of your negative experiences and feelings into one sense of hishtavos, one sense of simcha, one sense of kedusha. And Be'ezras Hashem, we'll continue next week, digging in a little bit more deeply to the different ideas contained in Torah Chaf Gimel. Hopefully this is just a rough and a quick overview of the general idea. We have a general framework, a general layout of what he's talking about. And then afterwards, in the coming couple of weeks, we'll dig in more deeply. We'll start to try to be medaic and break down what it is that he's talking about to try and understand a little bit more deeply, a little bit better, what we can do, how we can transform yagon va'anacha into simcha, what simcha really is, how do we obtain it, and then we'll be able to integrate fully into it.